Hi, this is Guy Burgess. For this post, I wanted to make an argument that the most important conflict in the world today is not the conflict between the left and the right, but rather conflicts between three groups. I call them the coexisters, the fighters, and the divide and conquerors. Now, last time I was talking about the notion that we stand at some sort of evolutionary divide, where we could go down one of three paths: the power with world, powerless world, or power over world. Obviously, the power with world's the preferable one. But you can look at this as a conflict. And I think that it makes a lot of sense that on the one hand, we have a conflict between advocates of a power with society, with democratic ideals, in which conflict is used constructively and borrowing on the term from Adam Smith, the invisible hand, in ways that guide society toward advancing the common good, as opposed to one of two groups of advocates, either advocates of power over that would like to be the autocrats and iron everybody with an invisible and a visible, really, iron fist. And then there's the powerless future of anocracy and anarchy that might well result if we can't agree on anything and we just wind up fighting with each other. Last time I also talked about a three-dimensional continuum that kind of gets at all of this. So you've got in each of the three corners autocracy, anocracy, and democracy. And in this context, what we want to do is resolve conflicts in a way that moves society closer to the democratic ideal. And here it's important to remember that the democratic reality, what we see in the world today, especially in the United States, is a long, long ways from the democratic ideal that we really hope to. But so in a sense, what we're fighting for is just the chance to try to make democracy work. And the key to doing this isn't to pursue some magic rainbow vision in which the left and the right magically agree in a great consensus on everything else. That's not a realistic option. What I think does make sense, though, is to have a world in which you have the left and the right continuing to confront one another through a process of constructive conflict that we actually learn from one another over time, and things get better. So I put together this really kind of maybe a little bit overdone graph, but hopefully it will explain the basic ideas of what I mean by a conflict between coexisters, fighters, and divide and conquerors. And to start with, imagine that you line up everybody in the population, and hopefully you can see this depending on the screen, but there's a faint line of individuals. And the idea is that you line them up according to their preferred outcome for the big political conflict between the left and the right. And so then you can sort of arbitrarily side one group's in side A on the left and the other group is in side B on the right. And then you look at, okay, what do these folks actually believe? And you find that folks sort of near the center of the line, folks that I used to call compromisers, but I don't think that's really quite the right label, so I'm taken to calling them constructive coexisters. Compromisers implies they agree on everything, and that's not necessarily the case. But so coexisters are folks that want to live their own way, but they're willing to coexist with somebody who wants to live a different way. The phrase constructive implies that they're also willing to cooperate in areas where they can mutually benefit. It's like dealing with climate change, for example. Then you can add on this list at the extremes, either on the left or the right, side A or side B, the fighters. And these are the guys that want to fight to win. And they're absolutely convinced that their side's right and the other side's evil. And there are a couple of different groups here. There's what I call the frustrated coexisters. And these are folks who would really like to be compromiser or coexisters in the center, but they're convinced that the other side is dominated by fighters that are trying to push them into the sea, and that they really don't have much of a choice but to fight back. And then there's the total victory fighters, and these are the folks that just think the other side's evil and they've got to be pushed into the sea or otherwise unequivocally defeated. And then there's another group. These are the folks I call the swing people. They're in the center, and they can't really quite decide whether they want to go and support the coexisters and a constructive coexistence, power with society, or whether they want to align themselves with the fighters and try to be the group that has power over everyone else. And then there's yet another group, and these are folks that I'm calling the power over divide and conquerors, which is kind of too long a name, but and these are folks who don't really much care about the central conflict between the left and the right, or side A or side B, but they just like to get as much as they can possibly get. And they know that they're a small group and their aspirations are certainly not morally justifiable, and that especially in a democracy, but to some extent in other kinds of political regimes as well, they know that they cannot possibly assemble enough power unless they can get a large fraction of the population on their side. So their whole point is to figure out how to manipulate the conflict between side A and side B, the left and the right, in ways that will serve their advantage. So the basic play is they patronize the fighters. So they say, well, we have, and in order to be a power over type, you've got to have a lot of money and power. You say, well, we're going to throw our wealth and power behind your cause. And so they make an alliance with the fighters, and especially the fighters that want total victory. And then, if you're going to have total victory, you got to get rid of this idea of coexistence and compromise. So then they attack the very idea of coexistence and compromise. Then you want to escalate the conflict. So swing people realize that, hey, they're in the fight of their lives, and they better align themselves with fighters because the coexisters are never going to make it. So you force the swing people to the fighter side. And then you just want to make sure that you don't lose, and preferably you win something. And then this is the big payoff where the power over types get to exact some sort of tribute. And you can make a pretty good case, though certainly not ironclad, that a lot of the enormous transfer of wealth to the very, very rich that we've seen in the last few decades is attributable to this dynamic. But there are clearly lots of motivations behind the power over types. Some of them are clearly tyrants or tyrant wannabes. There are others that sort of follow an Ayn Rand philosophy and believe in unfettered competition, and this is just the way the world works. So if you're in an all-out competitive environment, you might as well go all out and see how much you can get. And then there's also a Darwinian selection process that comes into play. Darwin, if you don't use all of the power options available to you in our highly competitive political environment, basically you're never going to be heard from, because the people who do get noticed and stay around and have the power to influence events are willing to play hardball, as they say. Now, there are a lot of tricks that the power over fighter types can use to attack the coexisters and to undermine their ability to influence events and actually to move society toward this kind of power with world that we're talking about. They can certainly go ahead and physically attack the coexisters, as the long history of assassinations of peacemakers demonstrates, whether it's King or Gandhi or Sadat or Rabin. They can morally attack the very idea of compromise. It's wrong to compromise one's values, and here it says coexisters one's values. That's a typo. Should be compromise one's values. You can attack the character and courage of anybody who wants to coexist because they're not strong enough to fight for what's right. You can subtly drive this escalation spiral through provocateurs, and so nobody quite knows who started it, and it keeps getting more and more violent, more and more serious, but nobody can be blamed. So what you do once you drive the escalation spiral is you take the idea of compromise off the table. You want to cultivate the illusion of invincibility and certain victory. You can't get people to come fight if they think they might lose. And you want to hide and discredit the costs of war and the benefits of coexistence. So you make the war seem either figurative or literal, seem cheaper than it's going to be, and the benefits of coexistence also a lot less than they might otherwise be. The problem is that coexisters don't have much defense in these circumstances. They have inadequate or or even no physical defense against assassination attempts and attempts to intimidate folks. And just this sort of inability to physically challenge and actually raise what amounts to an army to protect themselves is part of the problem. There's a certain reluctance to call out the fighters because you figure, well, at some point we need them to sign off on the compromise or we're not going to get anywhere. It gets really hard to unequivocally expose the provocateurs that are driving the escalation spiral. And it gets a little dicey to defend the morality of compromising one's deeply held values. And this sort of, it gets tricky. When you see just how much people really believe in some of these things, to actually agree to coexist with and tolerate somebody who believes something fundamentally different that you think is evil, it's hard to do. There are also taboos against questioning the heroism and sacrifice of fighters, and there are always risks of double cross and how one protects against that. And there are lots of stories about how this has played out over history. This is an interesting retrospective of how people are using divide and conquer strategies in the relatively recent political environment, which I recommend. So the big thing that we need is better defense strategies for the coexisters. They need to be able to expose the hate-mongering divide and conquer strategies, which once they're exposed are morally indefensible. Expose the false promise of total victory. A lot of the fighters think, well, we're going to really win. No, you're not. You're going to have to come to terms and live with the other side. Promote commonality to balance diversity. We can celebrate diversity, and we can celebrate very different sets of communities with very different moral beliefs, but we need some sort of commonality too that ties us all together. We need to strengthen democratic civic education and values. The whole idea of a power with democratic society is something that has to be at the core of everybody's core values. And just in general, embrace this notion of constructive coexistence. So the bottom line is that we've got ourselves in a trap where we keep focusing on the conflict between the left and the right, and each little event is seen as, okay, this is tipping things a little closer to the left or the right, and it's good news or it's bad news, but it's always a fight between the left and the right. And we need to start focusing on the real conflict between the power over folks who are trying to push and intensify the conflict, often for very, very selfish reasons. And the power with folks who are trying to find some way in which we can make a power with democratic society work. And if we can do that, we're going to discover that an awful lot of conflicts aren't so intractable. Because a big part of the reason why we can't constructively deal with our conflicts is that people are actively trying to prevent us from doing so. And we just can't let them.